to the first research colloque of the semester from the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies. And we are passing around a little paper with some events, some of the events of the semester that we have information already, so that you know what they are, and that you can plan to attend. First, you don't know how excited and honored and happy I am that I am presenting today Sonia Nieto. I have known Sonia Nieto since she came to Massachusetts, to Amherst, many years ago when she came to do her doctorate at the university. And I was also a graduate student, and we used to live at the same apartment complex that most apartments were housing graduate students. And here we are. So, what, 36, 40 years later? 41 years later. More than 41 years later, and I am getting this honor and this pleasure of introducing her. So, I know that some of you might already know about her, but I am going to just give kind of a slightly formal official introduction to Sonia Nieto. Dr. Sonia Nieto has devoted her professional life to questions of diversity, equity, and social justice in education. A native of Brooklyn, New York, she began her teaching career in 1966 in an intermediate school in Brooklyn, later moving to PS 25 in the Bronx, the first fully bilingual school in the Northeast. Her university career started in the Puerto Rican Studies Department at Brooklyn College. She and her family moved to Amherst in 1975, where she completed her doctoral degree here at UMass, returning a year later to begin her long academic career here. She taught pre-service and practicing teachers and doctoral students for 26 years before retiring in 2006. Dr. Nieto's research focuses on multicultural education, teacher education, and the education of students of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. She has written or edited 11 books. Her first book, Affirming Diversity, is now in its 6th edition and is used widely in teacher education courses in the United States and abroad. And the first edition, in 1992, was selected for the Museum of Education's Educational Reader's Guide as one of the 100 books that helped define the field of education in the 20th century. She has also written dozens of books, chapters, as well as articles, and is the editor of the Language, Culture, and Teaching Service, a series by Routledge, currently comprising over 20 titles. Dr. Nieto has received numerous awards for her scholarly work, teaching, activism, and advocacy, including 6 honorary doctorates. In 2016, she was ranked among the top 35 university-based education scholars in the RHSU EduScholar Public Influence Rankings. She has served as a visiting scholar at many national and international universities. Sonia is married to Angel Nieto, a poet, children's book author, and former middle and high school teacher. They have raised 2 daughters, Alicia and Marisa, and a granddaughter, Jasmine, and are the proud grandparents of 12 grandchildren. And Jasmine is right now an advisee of Jose Ornelas, my husband. So that's what happened here in Amherst. We see generations, actually, in Amherst, we see generations of children. I have had in my class children of students who were my students when I was a graduate student. And so that's She will be speaking today on Brooklyn Dreams, My Life in Public Education, a memoir.
Yeah, please come down and have a seat. The seats here. So, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. And I thought that I would begin by, well, let me tell you what I I'm planning on doing today. I'm going to read from the memoir, and I decided that I would start more or less with when we moved to Massachusetts, which, as Gloria said, was 41 years ago. And in fact, we were next door neighbors. And a story that I always tell her, or remind her about, is that my daughter Alicia was 5, and one day we couldn't find Alicia anywhere. And I was panicking a little bit because she wasn't a wild kid or anything, and she was nowhere to be found. We lived in townhouse apartments. That's where we lived. We lived in 5, I think we lived in 6 or 7. And all of a sudden she comes, Gloria brings Alicia, oh, we were hanging out at my house, we were having a snack, we were talking. And Alicia is now a teacher in the Amherst Regional Middle School. So I thought I would start with when we came here, because when I do book readings, I like to make them relevant to the place where I am. So when I was at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, I talked about my experience at the Puerto Rican Studies Department at Brooklyn College. And when I've spoken about my teaching career before becoming an academic, I focus on that. So before we get to Massachusetts, I just want to sort of set it up a little bit so that you know where I'm coming from. So I started out as a teacher. You know, one thing that I've always said is that I've always been at the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the right time, depending on how you look at it. Because when I started teaching, it was in Ocean Hill, Brownsville in New York, and it was in the middle of the community control uproar in New York City, which was, most of you probably won't know about it, but it was a very contentious time in public education in New York City about who should control the schools. We're still having that argument today, but we've gone through different sort of iterations of it. So that's where I got my baptism by fire. I was 22 years old, and I started teaching this place where there were arrests all the time, and there were teacher walkouts, and so on and so forth. From there, 2 years later, I went to teach at the first bilingual school in the Northeast. So bilingual ed was completely new. I mean, the first school had been in Miami, in Dade County, and then the second one was in the Bronx. So I was there at the beginning of bilingual education. And then I was recruited to teach in the Puerto Rican Studies Department at Brooklyn College because they had a program co-sponsored with the School of Education to train bilingual teachers. And since at the time, bilingual education in New York meant Puerto Rican, it was housed in the Puerto Rican Studies Department and the School of Education. And so that's where I was right before coming to Massachusetts. And the reason that we decided to move to Massachusetts is because I decided that I loved doing what I was doing, which was teacher preparation. And I wanted to do it for the rest of my life, but I didn't have a doctorate. I was an instructor there. I was very young, and I knew that I could never get a job if I didn't have a doctorate, so I looked around at different places, and the one that really piqued my interest was UMass, which was a very interesting place at the time. Not that it's not now, but it was really an experimental sort of place doing lots of interesting things, some which were outrageous and some which were very exciting. So that's why we moved. And the other, I guess, to be honest, I had been in the Puerto Rican Studies Department for 3 years, and they were some of the most exciting years of my life politically. I learned a great deal. They were also exhausting. And so I think I needed a little break from that, because every week we had demonstrations, we had takeovers, we had arrests, we had all of this stuff always going on. And it was great. I learned a lot. And so I decided that one of the things that I've said, that I've really thought about a lot, is that I honed my speaking skills not speaking at academic conferences, which is where most graduate students learn to speak in public, but at demonstrations on the quad at Brooklyn College. And so that was great training, but I didn't get very much in terms of academic training when I was at Brooklyn College. So I knew that I had to add to my repertoire of skills. We had the final year that I was there, the third year, was a very contentious, tumultuous year because we were looking for a new chairperson for our department. And the Brooklyn College wanted to impose their own person. And so we went through a year of, those demonstrations and speaking and arrests. And so I was one of the BC 44, the 44 people arrested for taking over the registrar's office. Came back the following day. We slept in court all night and came back the following day practicing the chants that we would start with when we got back to the quad. So we got back to the quad and there were 2,000 students waiting for us. It was, just an amazing time. And our chant was, BC 44, we've come back to give you more. And we did. But that was a very heady time, and it just taught me so much about ethnic studies. I mean, I was Puerto Rican, but I had never really learned anything about about the history. I knew about the culture. And so that was right before we came here. So I'll start with that. And so this is the chapter before we moved to Massachusetts, and I just want to read a bit from here about how difficult it was to leave Brooklyn. I was a Brooklyn girl, born and raised. I always lived there, except when I went to Spain to study for my master's degree, right after college. So I wrote about how difficult it was to leave my family because my father had died just 2 years earlier, and my mother really counted on us a lot. But I also knew that this was the time to do it if I ever was going to study for a doctor. Then when it came time to tell my colleagues, I was concerned that they might react negatively. I was afraid my commitment to the department, my students, and ethnic studies in general would be questioned. I even fretted that they might see me as a traitor to the cause. Nothing of the sort happened. From the beginning, they completely embraced my decision to leave and supported it. As for me, I knew I had given the department, the students, and my colleagues everything I could, and I was ready for a new chapter in my life. As we prepared to move to Massachusetts, I had mixed feelings about leaving Brooklyn College. My time there had been incredibly enriching, but looking back, I also saw the tremendous toll that political activism had taken on the program, the faculty, and especially the students. Only a few of the most active students, for instance, ever managed to graduate with a degree, although some did graduate and even went on to successful careers. Those who did not graduate had gained a valuable experience, but only these students would know if the experience helped them in the long run. The faculty and the program, for the most part, did well, though it did take some time for the Department of Portuguese Studies to come into its own. I should mention that Maria Sanchez, our choice for chair, did become the chair of the department after this long struggle that we had. Thanks to the vision of Maria Sanchez and later of the renowned historian Virginia Sanchez-Toro, who followed Maria as chair, the department was placed on firm organizational and intellectual footing. But again, this took time. Our early struggles at Brooklyn College yielded uncertain permanent gains. Most Puerto Rican studies departments have in fact survived, but their existence has always been precarious. And they have had to struggle for legitimacy and recognition. Many of the original departments have evolved to embrace a more pan-Latino identity. This evolution is as it should be, given the changing demographics in New York City, where Puerto Ricans are no longer the majority Latino group. While the number of Puerto Rican and other Latino studies at CUNY colleges, that's the City University of New York, has grown substantially, the same is not true of the number of Puerto Rican faculty throughout the CUNY system. The year with the highest number of Puerto Rican faculty was 1975, the year that I left. A policy brief from the New York Latino Research and Resources Network documented that between 1970 and 1974, the number of Puerto Ricans on the CUNY instructional staff increased by 173, or approximately 70%. That just shows how few we were to start with. Just a year later, the number of Puerto Rican instructional staff reached 245, CUNY's highest number ever. Since then, the number has declined steadily to only 131 in 2002. At Brooklyn College specifically, Puerto Rican tenure-track full-time faculty represented a meager 1.9% of the total faculty in 2002. So things have indeed gotten worse. Puerto Ricans at CUNY have in fact fared worse in terms of faculty representation than any other federally protected group. This despite the substantial increase in the number of Puerto Ricans who now have doctorates. Since 1972, when I began as an instructor at Brooklyn College. The same policy brief reported that in the 1970s, 0.2% of the total number of U.S. doctoral recipients were Puerto Ricans on average. By 2002, the proportion had improved to 1.2%. But we should also see this in the number of full-time tenure-track Puerto Rican faculty, and we don't see that. The report concludes the following, quote, "The Puerto Rican full-time faculty is vanishing little by little, since not enough new hires are replacing those who are retiring or leaving the institution." And I conclude that part by saying perhaps it's time for a return to the militancy of the early 1970s. Leaving Brooklyn College made me realize that I would never be the same Sonia Nieto as before. My whole outlook on life changed as I developed a more critical consciousness about life, education, culture, and politics. I could no longer watch the news on TV or read anything. Talk about watching the news on TV. Okay. Or read anything without thinking about the political implications. Issues of colonization, patriarchy, and race would always be on my mind, particularly as they related to education. I learned to be more courageous, more direct, less afraid of upsetting the status quo through my classes and interactions with students. At the same time, I learned that my job was not to teach others to be like me, but rather to open their eyes to different perspectives, to educate in the truest sense of the word. The focus of my political work became clearer. While some of my colleagues focused on the independence of Puerto Rico, I did not. Though I sympathized with the cause, I knew that no matter how Puerto Rican I felt, I would always live in the United States. It is my country of birth and upbringing, the place where my siblings and children and grandchildren live. With my growing consciousness, I also realized that although I might not have had the language to adequately express it, social justice, equity, and diversity would define my life's work. My focus then became, and has been ever since, the education of students for whom the U.S. public education system has not worked equitably. My goal was to help change that. And so then we go into the next chapter, which is when we moved to Massachusetts. Angel, Alicia, and I moved to Amherst, Massachusetts on August 19, 1975, a month shy of my 32nd birthday. Our first place was what in New York might be called a two-story private house, but in Massachusetts is known as a duplex apartment. That was a townhouse, which was very nice in 1975. Even though it was small, I was thrilled that for the first time in my life, I would have a second floor and 2 bathrooms, as well as sliding glass door to the little patio outside our living room. After living in a big city all my life, being in a small town seemed like a dream. Clean streets, no traffic to speak of, plenty of parking, little shops, no hassle getting to and from everything. Lots of places for Alicia to run and play, and numerous small-town community events. In addition, though Amherst was not as ethnically and racially diverse as it is now, the town surprised me with more diversity than we had expected, particularly among the graduate students at the university. It didn't take long for Angel and me to decide that this was where we wanted to establish roots and raise our family. I was anxious to begin my classes, and after moving in, getting to know the town a bit, making our way to the local farmers market, and I thought, how quaint. Opening a bank account, registering Alicia for first grade at our local public school, and sundry other moving in tasks, I was ready to begin my doctoral studies. The first course I walked into was Foundations of Multicultural Education, taught by Professor Bob Suzuki. Bob's class changed everything. Little did I realize then that the topic of this course would become my life's work. The UMass School of Education, recently renamed the College of Education, was a fascinating place in those years. Regarded as notorious by its critics and innovative by its supporters, it had been transformed by the forward-thinking Dean Dwight Allen from a fairly traditional program to one that challenged most of the conventions of schools of education and even the rest of academia. For one thing, about a third of the faculty that Dean Allen recruited were from other disciplines. This is how Bob Suzuki, an aeronautical engineer by training and formerly a faculty member in the aerospace engineering department at the University of Southern California, had come to UMass. The graduate record examination, a requirement for admission at most major universities, was not required at the School of Education. Is it now? Do you know?
Good question. I don't think so, but it's a good question.
Dean Allen also recruited the most diverse faculty and student body the campus of the town had ever seen. In 1975, greater diversity among faculty and students was something that was just beginning to be demanded at other universities. But the UMass School of Education had been working toward it for several years. The school might have never reached as high a level of diversity among both students and faculty as when Allen was dean. The School of Education also sponsored exciting and innovative conferences and other events that put UMass on the map. In my years as a doctoral student, we hosted scholars from Buckminster Fuller to Paulo Freire, among many others. Unfortunately, when Dean Allen left the school just a month before I arrived, many of his innovations began to slowly erode. By my fourth and final year as a doctoral student, some of the push for experimental courses had disappeared, replaced by more traditional topics and formats. When I retired as a professor 30 years later, many more of the earlier innovations had disappeared. Unchanged, however, was the school's and university's stated commitment to social justice. At a time when these words were rarely heard at a college or university, or in relation to public education, social justice was already entrenched at UMass. It is what drew me to and kept me at UMass even years later when I had numerous opportunities to go elsewhere. If that commitment was not always strictly honored, indeed, it was widely recognized as a community shared value, and that itself is significant. So let me just take off my watch here so that I know what time. Okay, so going on. Okay, I just want to mention one other thing. Luis Fuentes was one of the faculty members who we brought, and those of you who have been around a while probably remember him. We had a group called La Colectiva, which was made up, it means the collective, it was made up of doctoral students who had received the Title VII Fellowship, which was in bilingual education. And in my first year, we had two faculty members, Silvia Viera and Sara Nieves. So imagine, listen to the I-A and the I-E of all these names. Silvia Viera, Sara Nieves, and Sonia Nieto. They got us confused all the time. I was the doctoral student. But at the end of that year, Silvia left. She said she had made a commitment to be here for 3 years, and so she was leaving. Then Sara, who said that she was staying, left in the middle of the summer. That left our group of 10 doctoral students with fellowships, plus other doctoral students, many master's students, and many undergraduate students with no faculty. So we organized ourselves into something that we call La Colectiva. And we taught all the courses, we did all the advising, and so on. And we recruited Luis Fuentes, who had been an administrator, a teacher and administrator in New York City. And the other person who was asked to say was Gloria Guevara, who was a doctoral student at the time. They also asked me, and I said, no, I want to finish my doctorate first, because I know if I take this on, I'll never be able to finish it. So Luis Fuentes, the other faculty member in La Colectiva recruited that year, became another significant mentor to me. Luis was a tried and true veteran of the struggle for bilingual education and community control movements in New York City. He had served as community superintendent on the Lower East Side, what Latinos christened as Loisaida. And because newspaper and television news reports often referred to him as the controversial Luis Fuentes, Luis used to joke that his children thought his first name was controversial. Feisty was another adjective often used to describe him. He did everything from introducing bilingual education to District 1 in Loisaida, to changing the cafeteria offers to reflect the Latino, African American, and Chinese heritage of the children in the schools. Besides becoming dear and close friends of ours, Luis and his wife, Dora, became central public figures and significant leaders in the Latino community in Amherst and throughout Western Massachusetts. Luis's wife, Dora, was also a gifted educator. A school district administrator in New York City before she and Luis moved to Amherst, she became the director of bilingual education in the Holyoke Public Schools, and later the first Puerto Rican school principal in the history of Holyoke. My doctoral education at UMass was, intellectually speaking, the most exhilarating time of my life. Through the courses I took, the books I read, and the people with whom I interacted, faculty, other students, guests, and speakers, my eyes were opened wide. I was able to give voice to a deepening consciousness about education, culture, and politics. I was like a sponge soaking up everything in reach. I did all the required work and more in my courses. And there was no pressure about grades because everything at the time in school grade was pass-fail. Everything, undergraduate, master's, and doctoral courses. I was free to explore and experiment with the ideas that most intrigued me, whether it was to investigate the philosophy of John Dewey, read the story of Sylvia Ashton Warner, or study the work of Maria Montessori. It was especially Paulo Freire's ideas about education that captivated me from the start and that profoundly changed my outlook on education and life. After I read his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it was inevitable that my philosophy about education would evolve. A number of his ideas grabbed hold of me from the start and have influenced my teaching, my philosophy of education, and my research and writing ever since. Given his experience as a literacy worker, the role that led to first his being jailed and later exiled from Brazil, one of the key ideas he discussed in pedagogy was that it isn't sufficient for people to quote, to learn to quote, read the word, but that true learning is about, quote, reading the world. That is, people need to understand the world in which they live so that they can change oppressive conditions. What particularly appealed to me about this idea is that it was built on the belief in people's agency, their ability to change the conditions in which they live. Freire's focus on education, let's see, no, I don't want to start there. When I became a professor at UMass a year after completing my doctoral studies, I consistently used Freire's work in my class. Although there were considerable differences between teaching peasants in Brazil to read and teaching young people in American urban areas, his philosophy transcended geography, culture, and time. After reading one or another of his books, I would have my students write a letter to Paulo at the end of the semester. And I did this for years. And the first year I actually sent him the letters, which I hope he read. He had been here until we had met, and I sent them to him. I collected some of these letters over the years, and in 2008 I edited a book of those letters, including several from well-known Freirean scholars. The book, Dear Paulo, Letters from Those Who Dare Teach was my way of thinking. I began to understand as well that the role of most schools around the world is to have young people serve as apprentices in what Michel Foucault calls the regimes of truth. That is, the underlying truths that help perpetuate the status quo, even or perhaps especially when the status quo is unjust. Let's see. I think that's where I'm going to leave it off, except I want to now go back to the beginning, which is the introduction, to give you more of a sense of how the book actually follows my life, personal and professional. I haven't said very much about the personal. This book describes my journey from a declining urban elementary school in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn in the 1950s to my doctoral work in bucolic Amherst, Massachusetts in the 1970s and beyond. My story, however, is not just one of individual achievement or a Puerto Rican version of the Horatio Alger story. I refuse to be cast as, quote, the Puerto Rican exception, as if I was so different from other Puerto Ricans. Rather than just my story, the book is about the potential promise and ultimately the disappointing outcome of public education as it was first envisioned at the dawn of public schooling in mid-19th century United States. Granted, initial pronouncements of the benefits of a free, tax-supported, universal public education were steeped in paternalism, not to mention racial and ethnic exclusivity in that they included only children of European descent. Recently freed slaves, indigenous Americans, Mexicans, and other non-Europeans were conspicuously missing from such noble pronouncements and are, not coincidentally, those most neglected by public education today. Nevertheless, the idea of a universally available and common school experience for rich and poor, and for those of all ethnic and racial backgrounds, remains a lofty, though perhaps never to be realized, goal. It is, however, one that is worth fighting for. Whether or not the promise of public education will ever be achieved, those who have benefited the least have been the ones to most struggle, most fervently, for this goal. In fact, the educational history of the United States is replete with the stories of such struggles, from desegregation to multicultural education, from gender fair to special education, and others. Sadly, today, the forces of privatization and marketization, the scapegoating of teachers, the high-stakes testing frenzy, and continuing racism and bigotry, not to mention the, quote, savage inequalities that Jonathan Kozol wrote about 25 years ago, and the drastically increasing inequality, are making the goal of an equal and high-quality education more unreachable than ever. As a result, the gulf between the haves and have-nots is not only reflected in our public schools, but also exacerbated and perpetuated by them. If this situation continues, the grand vision of public education imagined by its proponents over a century ago is certain to disappear. Yet what brings all the themes of my life together is precisely public education. Mine, as well as that of my sister and brother, my children and grandchildren, the children I talk directly, and the children I have never met, but who have nonetheless been my professional concern throughout my life. In writing my book, I have understood perhaps more clearly than ever that without public education, my life would be vastly different and immeasurably poorer, not necessarily in economic terms, but in meaning and purpose. Given current defeatist ideas about the purpose and meaning of education, I hope that this book offers instead a story of the redeeming value of public education, if it is ever given a chance. So I will leave it at that, and I would like to just invite some conversation, your thoughts on these things, questions, anything that you'd like to bring up. I stunned you.
we do have some pre-service teachers here, teacher candidates in secondary English ed who are currently training and developing teachers. So I invite them to ask questions, but in the meantime, you know, this is that wait time that we do. But I would love to hear what you might offer folks who are about to engage in this endeavor to work with young people, many of whom are culturally and linguistically diverse. We have a range of contexts, so we're in suburban, urban, and rural contexts. What would be, I know it's hard to sum it up in a line or a platitude or a cliche, but are there some pieces of wisdom or advice from your own experiences? And considering, I guess, the current political backdrop in education.
So first, vote. Everybody has to vote. That's the first thing.
Yes.
Secondly, I just want to thank you all, those who are going to be teachers, for joining the profession. We need you desperately. I know, how many of you are in Keisha's class? Okay. All right. So we need you desperately. We really do. I'd also say, you know, hold on for dear life, because you are entering education at a difficult time. At the same time, you know, I would remind you, because I know that you all came into it not to make money or to become famous, but because you want to help influence the lives of young people. And just keep that in mind. Keep it in mind, even on your worst days. And you will have worse days. You will have some very difficult days, but in the end, you will also have a lot of redeeming days that will make it worthwhile. I just got an email today from a former student of my husband, who's now a doctoral student. He was in Holyoke when my husband was a teacher in Holyoke. He was one of his high school students. Luis never should have made it as far as he's made it. And after he graduated from Holyoke High School, he came to UMass. And he was he studied education. And one day I was invited to a class that was using affirmative diversity in my book to talk with students and to sign their books and so on. So he came over to me, I didn't know him, and he said, "Excuse me, Professor Nieto, do you know somebody named Nieto?" Yeah, I know him very well. And he was so excited. He said, "I never thought I would find this man again. He changed my life. You know, it's because of him that I'm here. Because he wasn't only a teacher to us, but he was a father to us. He was a counselor. He was a guide." Now, Luis was very close to his father, so he didn't say this to disrespect his father. It's that his father could not give him what Angel gave him. And so, and as I say, Luis is now studying for his doctorate, and he told me that his doctoral work will focus on, you know, we all write our autobiographies in the work that we do. We'll focus on first generation Latino college-going students and their residential experience. And that's Luis. Luis Frontan. So, you know, you may not hear from students when you're teaching them about the difference that you've made. It may take 10, 20, 30 years, but you will hear about the difference that you've made in their lives. So, you know, generally, what I tell young people, or, you know, even career changers who are going into education, I tell them a few pieces of advice that I think have worked well. You know, I've told you a few of them. You know, I think you have to remember that when you're a teacher, you are an advocate. That's what your role is. You're an advocate. Whether you know, you might not want to use the word political, but the work that you're doing is political. If you don't like that word, say, you know, the work that you're doing is advocacy. Because it is, you're advocating on behalf of your students. Take time for yourselves too. And this is something that a lot of us have had to learn, because we don't take time for ourselves. So when you're a teacher, one of the teachers who I asked to write, who I interviewed for a book of mine, wonderful, wonderful teacher from New Haven, Connecticut. And he started out completely, you know, unaware of what it was like to teach it, but he wanted to teach there. He's a Vietnamese American guy. He wanted to teach there because he wanted to be in an area where he could really make a lot of difference, and not in most of the areas in Connecticut, he said, which were more privileged. But they gave him hell, and it was very hard for him. But he stuck it out, and he became one of the most beloved teachers there. And last time I heard from him, he was an assistant principal, and he said his job now is to support the teachers. And when it's 5 o'clock and there are still teachers in the building, to make them go home. And so that's a lesson to learn, I think, that you also have family, you have friends. Another teacher who I interviewed for that book wrote about the importance of biking to work and seeing sunsets and enjoying jazz and going out to have a drink with his friends. All of those things are important. Yes, teaching can be a really important part of your life, but don't forget the other parts of your life. So have a life. Yes.
I'm Lily. Hi. Your reputation goes way beyond Amherst. And before I came here, one of my friends in Portland, Oregon, told me about Sonia and Nieto and said I should look for you. And I think he knows you through the wider teacher organizing.
Oh, the Rethinking Schools.
Yeah, so I wondered if you could talk some about the movement of teachers around the country, including Rethinking Schools.
Well, Rethinking Schools is like my favorite organization. You know, if you don't know it and you're going to be a teacher, make sure that you subscribe. You know, Teaching Tolerance is another one. I don't like the term, but I love the organization. They do a lot of good work. Rethinking Schools is an organization of mostly teachers from around the country who are activists and advocates, and who and the organization has lots of publications that are really fabulous, and you should look into, and you should, besides subscribing to the newsletter. I don't know if they call it newsletter or magazine or whatever, but it's really excellent. And so for me, that is like one of the most important organizations, because when you look at policy and how it's made for schools, teachers don't generally have a voice. And so we need to look at organizations where they can have a voice. Most of the articles in Rethinking Schools are written by teachers. Many of the articles in Teaching Tolerance are written by teachers. A lot of the books that Rethinking Schools writes are written or co-written by teachers, and they're really, really wonderful. So I started, you know, in my work with teachers, who I support, you know, tremendously, because I know how difficult it is. I always say, look, I'm married to a teacher. I have a daughter who's a teacher, a sister who's a teacher. It doesn't go beyond that because my parents didn't graduate from high school. So, but for us, teaching is, you know, really, really important. Now, that's not to say that every teacher is an excellent teacher. We know that that's not true. And there are some people who should never become teachers and should have left before they even started. But there are really excellent, stellar teachers, and then there are, you know, another group of teachers who I think are in the majority who are there for the right reasons and don't get the support that they need. And so they can become really disillusioned and angry and bitter and jaded. And so I think it's important for those of us in teacher education to support teachers, and for those in, administrators and policymakers and so to support teachers. So for me, that's why it's been really important to work with teachers, and I've been so blessed because I have met so many fabulous, excellent teachers, and who I continue to learn from all the time. So, when I'm asked to speak to a group of teachers, I'm just thrilled. I mean, one of my favorite experiences was on the West Coast, but in San Francisco. There's an organization called Teachers for Social Justice. I don't know how many of you have heard of it, but it's a really wonderful organization. So they asked if I would go and speak at their conference, and they told me, we'd love to have you here, but we are a volunteer organization. We can't pay you at all. We can bring you out here. We can put you up. And I said, of course, I'll go. It was a group of teachers. So the way that they paid for my trip out there is that they had people who had miles from their travel, and they put it together to get me a ticket on United. And they had the husband of one of the volunteers, one of the organizers of the group, members of the group, worked at a fancy hotel in San Francisco. So he got me a comp room, and that's how I stayed there. But what was really, really impressive was that there was a group of 1,700 teachers who came to this conference. 1,700. They did not pay a penny to go. The organizers, made it completely free, had lunch for everybody, and these teachers were the most enthusiastic, committed teachers I had met, because here they were really doing something very important and contributing. So not only the teachers who were at the conference, but the teachers who were the organizers. So for me, that says a great deal, but I think that too often teachers don't get that kind of recognition, and it makes a huge difference for your professional development. So that's another piece of advice that I would give, is that stay active in the profession. Don't think that when you finish your master's, you're a teacher and that's all there is to it. No, that's when you're starting. That's not when you're finishing. That's when you're starting. And so that means, and I know this is so hard because, for my daughter to get away, she has to take personal days sometimes to go to a conference. It's not like at the university level that we decide that we want to go to AERA or whatever other conference we're interested in, and a lot of that is paid for. And not only is it not paid for them, but they don't even have the time off. So work like hell to get time off so that you can go to conferences, and if you can't go to national ones, go to local ones. If you can't go to local ones, start your own reading groups, start your own way of getting your professional development. So I'll put in a little plug here. For those of you who are going to be teachers or are teaching already, join the National Writing Project. My daughter did after 10 years in the classroom. She's now been teaching 22 years. And when they moved here 11 years ago, a year later she was invited by a friend of hers to go to the Summer Institute of the National Writing Project. And she said it just changed everything for her because she was getting a little tired. She was getting what else, what's new now for me? And it just completely energized her to do this institute as a participant. And ever since then, that was 10 years ago, she's been one of the co-leaders or co-facilitators of the Summer Institute for the National Writing Project. So if you can become, and you don't have to be a writer, you don't have to teach language arts, although most of you are, but I've known math teachers who did the National Writing Project, health teachers, bilingual teachers, French teachers, all sorts of teachers of all subject areas, because it is the most rewarding kind of professional development you can get, because it's teachers teaching teachers, and your ideas are honored, and you can argue through all of the, ideas that you have for your classroom. Alicia said changed everything for her. She went back in September with so much energy and enthusiasm, and every summer, she said this past summer was the best one ever. And that's after all these years of doing it. And then she goes back to school in September with lots of energy. So that's some of the advice I would give. Honor teachers. That's what we need to do.
Sonia, what do you see as the future of education in the United States?
That depends on what we do. It really does. If things go the way that they're going right now, I'm just afraid of the, corporate takeover schools, and I think that the testing is getting a bit better, but there are people who have been through school in the past 15 years, and they think that education is about taking tests, because that's how they've gone to school. There's always another test. And now, of course, we all went through that, but not to the extreme that we've had in the past 20 years. So I think, I certainly see a lot of activism on the part of teachers, and I hope that would encourage all of you to become active in whatever way you can. And there are lots of different ways of doing it. So on the one hand, I see that, and that's a hopeful thing. On the other hand, I see more rigidity than I've seen in a long time. So, like I said, it depends on what we do as a nation and what we value. And when we say we value public education, how do we put that into practice? And public education alone cannot do it, because look at the inequality we have in our nation. It's so dramatic. And when schools can't do that, can't do it all. They can't change the situation that many kids and families are living in. So it has to be, that's one of the reasons why this election is so important, because it's about the future of public education. It's about not only public education, about our lives, really. So, I can't see the future. I can only hope that people really take to heart what we say are our stated goals in this society. But, I have to say, I have gone to schools, very, very poor schools in poor communities, and some are wonderful, but many are not. And I have been to schools in wealthy communities that are public schools, and they're amazing, and I've been to private schools where, the well-heeled can send their kids. I remember walking out from one about 3 years ago near Washington, D.C., or in Washington, D.C. And I walked out, and I have to say I was in tears, because my reaction was that all kids should have this education. They had like 15 art teachers in this school, and it was a small private school. Every kid gets art all the time. They didn't have the test pressure. It's unbelievable what the differences are. I think we need to, come face to face with that, and not repeat the line of, there's equal opportunity for everybody, because there's not. But on a more hopeful note, I don't want to end with that. I do think that there is work to do. There's work to do, and that we can make a difference. I mean, look, if education weren't one of the most significant endeavors in the world, young people would not still be coming to the field. Because they know that they can make a difference. And that's what we need to remember.